Hi, my name is Carly Anderson, and I'm the Animal Welfare Lab Coordinator at the University of Wisconsin-River Falls. I'm also a master's student in the Veterinary Medicine Graduate Program at the University of Minnesota. Today I'll be presenting the results from our project entitled The Relationship of Tissue Dimensions and Captive Bolt Placement on Cadaver Heads for Mature Swine. To get started, I'd like to provide a bit of an outline for today's presentation. We'll start with an introduction, move into the materials and methods, followed by results, implications, limitations, conclusions, and finally acknowledgements. So to begin our introduction, penetrating captive bolt is a method of euthanasia that's approved for use in swine by the American Veterinary Medical Association, the AVMA, as well as the National Pork Board. Now, this method is approved with a common frontal placement by both organizations. You can see the frontal placement here and here in both diagrams from the 2013 and 2020 AVMA guidelines. Now, there have been two alternative placements that have been identified. These were identified in the 2013 AVMA euthanasia guidelines, and these are the temporal placement, which you can see here, and the placement behind the ear directed toward the opposite eye, which you can see in both of these images. Now, it's important to note that there was an update made to the euthanasia guidelines in 2020 stating that only the frontal placement is approved for use with captive bolt. The temporal and behind the ear placements are only approved for use with gunshot by the AVMA now. With regard to the frontal placement, I'd like to point out that there are inconsistencies across different guidelines as far as where that exact placement on the front of the head is. There have been very few studies published related to the captive bolt euthanasia of swine. Specifically, the method has been scientifically validated as an effective means of euthanasia for pigs weighing up to 120 kilograms, or about 265 pounds. And although the method is used in industry with success, it has not actually been validated as an effective means of euthanasia for pigs that are weighing more than 120 kilograms. More specifically, the frontal application site, our common application site, was not 100% effective in sows and boars that were estimated to weigh over 200 kilograms. This was the case for both animals in anesthetized trials and on-farm trials with live animals, and this 200 kilogram benchmark is about 440 pounds for reference. Now, with that, the behind the ear and temporal placements may serve as alternative locations for the euthanasia of these large sows and boars. However, peer-reviewed published data to validate either of these alternative placements for mature sows and boars did not appear to exist at the time of our study. And as such, this study was designed to serve as a first step in scientifically validating the temporal and behind the ear placements for the euthanasia of large sows and boars. Our objectives for this work were then to determine the tissue depth, cross-sectional brain area, and brain damage for the frontal, temporal, and behind the ear placements for the euthanasia of swine via penetrating captive bolt on sow and boar cadaver heads. We'll now move on to the materials and methods. For this work, 157 cadaver heads were obtained from sows and boars that were commercially slaughtered at a processing facility under federal inspection. 111 sow heads from animals with an average body weight of 231.8 kilograms, or about 509 pounds, were obtained, and heads from 46 boars, which had an average body weight of 229.9 kilograms, or about 506 pounds, were obtained. You might notice the smaller number of boar heads that were obtained, and this was due to the plant not purchasing as many large boars due to the COVID-19 pandemic. All heads that were obtained had the skin on and intact jowls, and an additional 6 centimeters of neck tissue was left on behind the ear to prevent tissue distortion from where the head is normally separated from its respective carcass. The body weights reported here were calculated from the hot carcass weight at the plant by using the dressing percentage information from the plant, which is 58% skinned as the dressing percentage, plus some weight that was added on to account for the extra neck tissue that would normally be on with the carcass. And all heads were collected across 8 sampling days, the first 6 between January and March of 2020, and an additional 2 days in July of 2020. All heads were transported from the processing facility where they were collected to the University of Wisconsin-River Falls Meat Science Laboratory. For transportation, all heads were placed into storage totes with secured lids, with 2 heads per tote. The heads were loaded into the totes at the time they were removed from their respective carcass and were stored outside for approximately 2 to 3 hours at ambient temperature prior to pickup. The heads were then transported for 188 kilometers, about 2 hours of travel time, at ambient temperature. Upon arrival to the meat lab at UW River Falls, the heads were stored in a walk-in cooler at approximately 2 to 4 degrees centigrade for 62 hours. You can see how the heads were stored in the cooler in this upper image and how the heads were loaded into the van for transport here. The penetrating captive bolt used in this study was a Jarvis pistol-type captive bolt that's 25 caliber. The long stunning rod nose piece assembly was also used, and Jarvis orange powder cartridges, which are 3.5 grain and 25 caliber, were used. This bolt, device, and cartridge combination were based upon manufacturer recommendations. The captive bolt travel distance, so the distance that the bolt extends from the barrel when activated for this specific device bolt length cartridge combination, is 76.2 millimeters or 3 inches, and you can see that distance highlighted here. We'll now move on to discuss the 3 captive bolt placements that were used and applied to heads in this study. We'll start with the frontal placement. The frontal shot was placed 3.5 centimeters above the optic orbits at the midline. You can see this here line on the bottom indicating the top of the eyes or the optic orbits. And then the midline is indicated here, and then that captive bolt is placed at a point 3.5 centimeters above that. For the temporal placement, the captive bolt shot was placed at the depression posterior to the outer corner of the eye, within the plane between the outer corner of the eye and the base of the ear. So you can see the eye here, and the base of the ear goes straight back from there. When you palpate the heads here, you can find a depression that's located about halfway between that, and that's where the captive bolt shot was placed for these heads. The behind the ear shot was placed directly caudal or behind the ear on the same plane as the eyes and targeting the middle of the opposite eye. You can see this here at the base of the ear. And then if we actually drew a line across the head over to the middle of the opposite eye and confirmed that we were targeting our placement there for these heads. Following the application of a captive bolt shot, all heads were split along the bolt path, so either along the frontal, temporal, or behind the ear bolt path using a meat bandsaw. We collected digital and thermal images. The thermal images were collected using a FLIR camera from 50.8 centimeters directly above and perpendicular to the exposed cut surface. All digital images included a 15 centimeter ruler, and images were taken of both halves of each head and were also taken in duplicate, both with and without a rod that was placed to indicate the bolt path. All heads were imaged both with and without the brain intact, so a total of 4 images were taken per side of each head, with the brain and with the rod, without the brain but with the rod. The digital images that were collected were used for measurement determination, and thermal images were used to determine the temperature of each brain at the time of imaging. From the images that were collected at the time of head processing, we collected 3 tissue thickness measurements: the soft tissue thickness, cranial thickness, and total tissue thickness. These were all measured in millimeters. You can see the cross-section of a frontal head, a temporal head, and a behind the ear head here. We'll go into more detail what each of these tissue thicknesses looks like for each placement on the next few slides. But I'd first like to give an overview of what the tissue thicknesses refer to. The soft tissue thickness refers from the tissue at the application site on the skin to the exterior surface of the cranium along the bolt path. The cranial thickness refers to the thickness from the exterior surface of the cranium to the interior surface of the cranium along the bolt path. Total tissue thickness then refers to the total soft tissue and cranial thickness from the site of the application to the interior surface of the cranium along the bolt path. This measurement was determined by adding the soft tissue and cranial thickness measurements together. We'll now zoom into a head from each of the 3 placements to see what these tissue thicknesses actually looks like. So on this head, we have our frontal head. This rod here is indicating the bolt path. You'll see the yellow on each side of the bolt path, and that indicates the soft tissue thickness. The blue line on each side indicates the cranial thickness, and then the total distance from the blue and the yellow lines indicates the total tissue thickness. If we move on to a zoomed in image of a temporal head, you'll see the same thing here with the red rod indicating the bolt path, the yellow on each side of that rod indicating the soft tissue thickness, and then the blue on each side indicating the cranial thickness. Again, the total distance from the yellow to the blue indicates the total tissue thickness along each side of the bolt path. If we move on to look at a behind the ear head, again we have our rod indicating the bolt path, the yellow lines indicating soft tissue thickness, blue lines indicating cranial thickness, and then the total distance from the blue all the way to the end of the yellow, indicating the total tissue thickness along each side of the bolt path for these heads. We also determined cross-sectional brain area from the same images of the heads that were collected at the time of head processing. This was done using Sketch and Calc, an online irregular area calculator. You can see the frontal brain area here, the temporal brain area here, and an example of the behind the ear brain area here. The brain area gives us an idea of the maximum target area we have to hit the brain with the captive bolt, so it's valuable for that. After talking through the tissue depth measurements and brain area, this slide provides a good overview of what all of the tissue depth measurements and brain areas look like across the three captive bolt placements to each other. We have the frontal, temporal, and behind the ear placements indicated on this slide. We also assessed brain damage from the heads that were collected at the time of head processing. This was done on a yes-no basis, where yes meant there was visually detectable damage to the brain, and no meant that there was not visually detectable damage to the brain. This was done overall for the brain, so if there was any damage to the brain, it was considered to be damaged. If there was no damage, it was considered to not be damaged. Now we'll move on to talk about the statistical analyses. For the tissue depth measurements and brain area, analyses were performed within the SAS 9.4 environment, and an ANOVA with a mixed procedure was done. A repeated statement with grouping by treatment and the Satterwhite method for degrees of freedom was used to account for unequal variances by treatment. We did not make comparisons between sex because of unknown sex-related morphological changes as the swine mature, and these changes could not accurately be factored into our model. Our focus was primarily on describing the differences that exist between placement within sex. Mean separation was performed and determined using students' t-tests with protection by the Bonferroni-Holm adjustment. Differences were considered to be significant when the p-value was less than 0.05. For the tissue depth measurements, we also calculated 95% upper reference limits. These are a 95% one-sided reference range that were computed using a t-based prediction interval for normally distributed data with unknown mean and standard deviation. We also calculated 90% confidence intervals for these values, and this was done using R version 4.0.2. For brain damage, we did not make statistical comparisons between placements, but instead reported the occurrence of brain damage along with 95% confidence intervals that were determined using the Klopper-Pearson exact method. This was also done in R. We'll now move on to discuss our results. To start, I'd like to give you a brief orientation to this graph, as we'll use a similar format on the next slide. In red, we have our cranial thickness. This dotted black pattern shows the soft tissue thickness, and the total height for each bar indicates the total tissue thickness. Again, this is the measurement in millimeters. We have our frontal, temporal, and behind the ear placements indicated on this slide. To start with total tissue thickness, this measurement was greatest for the behind the ear placement and was least for the frontal placement. For sows, this measurement was significantly different across all three captive bolt placements. If we look at soft tissue thickness, we'll see that this value was greatest for the behind the ear heads and least for our frontal heads. Again, this measurement was significantly different across all three captive bolt placements. If we look at cranial thickness, however, we'll see that that value is greatest for the frontal heads and least for the temporal heads. Again, this was significantly different across all three captive bolt placements. Now, ultimately, what matters is the total tissue thickness. However, the breakdown of tissue thickness between soft tissue and cranial thickness is important for captive bolt performance. This red line here indicates the bolt travel distance for the captive bolt device that was used in this study. That's the about 3 inches extension, or 76.2 millimeters. And the values reported on this slide are means for each of these. If we move on to look at the total tissue thickness results from our mature boars, again, we have the same setup with this graph with the frontal, temporal, and behind the ear placements, the total bar height indicating total tissue thickness, the red indicating cranial thickness, and the dotted pattern indicating soft tissue thickness. For our mature boars, we see that total tissue thickness was greatest in the behind the ear placement and least in the frontal placement. This measurement was significantly different across the three captive bolt placements. If we look at soft tissue thickness, we'll see that this was once again greatest in the behind the ear placement and least for our frontal placement. And again, this measurement was significantly different across the three captive bolt placements. If we move to cranial thickness, however, this value was only significantly different between the frontal and the temporal placements, and there was not evidence to support a significant difference between the frontal and behind the ear, or the behind the ear and temporal placements. And again, here's a red line to indicate the bolt travel distance for the captive bolt that was used in this study, just so you can see how that value and what the bolt travel distance relates to the means for each of these placements that was observed. We'll now move on to discuss the upper reference limit results for the total tissue thickness for our mature sows and mature boars. This value indicates the value at which we estimate 95% of the sow or boar heads will have less tissue depth then, and you can see this by the black dot that's located on each of these graphs. And then around that dot, we have a 90% confidence interval, which is indicated by the two black lines. All of the white dots that are shown on each of these plots indicate the distribution of the data for each sex and placement combination. Now, these values are particularly valuable for the manufacturers of captive bolt devices, and that's because these values can be used as a metric to predict whether a captive bolt device with a known penetration, such as the one we used in this study, would have the capacity to reach and disrupt the brain in the majority of sows or boars in a given captive bolt placement. So I'd now like to walk through the results that we observed. We'll start with sows. So for the frontal placement, the upper reference limit value, or the value where we would expect 95% of the sows in the frontal placement to have tissue depth less than, was 64.1 millimeters. For the temporal placement in sows, we'll see that here, that value was 83.9 millimeters. And for the behind the ear placement in sows, that value was 103.4 millimeters. If we move on to look at our results for boars, if we start again with our frontal placement, the value that we expect and estimate 95% of boar heads to have less tissue depth than in the frontal placement is 56.3 millimeters. For the temporal placement, this value is 83.4 millimeters, and for the behind the ear placement for boars, this value is 113.5 millimeters. Again, here's the red line indicating the bolt travel distance for the captive bolt that was used in this study, and that's 76.2 millimeters. Now on this slide, you'll notice a significant and substantial difference from where that line fell on our means. This is really what's meaningful because we want to ensure that the captive bolt has the capacity and ability to reach and disrupt the brain in the majority, 95% or more, of our sows and boars. Now, we did not make statistical comparisons between these upper reference limits because a much larger sample size is needed. However, this is an important first estimate to report and provides valuable information. For our brain area results, we have the captive bolt placements along the bottom as we did with our tissue depth measurements. So we have our frontal, temporal, and behind the ear placements, but this time the dotted pattern indicates sows and the solid red bar indicates boars. For both sows and boars, we observed the greatest brain area in the frontal placement and the smallest brain area in the temporal placement. For sows and boars both, these measurements were significantly different across all three captive bolt placements. We'll now move on to discussing brain damage results. Before we get into actual brain damage, I want to discuss brain contact plane first. This information tells us if we were working with a bolt of unlimited length, would that bolt have contacted the brain based on where it was placed? This doesn't actually indicate damage. That will come on the next slide. So for our sow heads, the heads that were shot in a frontal placement, 100% of the time, the brain was within the plane of bolt travel, which is good. That's what we want to see. For the heads that were shot in the temporal placement, the brain was within the plane of bolt travel 97.5% of the time, or for all but one head. For the sow heads that were shot in the behind the ear placement, the brain was within the plane of bolt travel 87.2% of the time. If we move on to look at our brain damage results from sows, these are the values that tell us where we saw damage. Again, we didn't make statistical comparisons between this, so it's simply reporting what we observed. For the sows that were shot in the frontal placement, we observed damage to 96.2% of those heads. The 95% confidence interval associated with this is 80.4 to 99% of heads would have had damage. For the temporal heads that were sow heads and shot in that placement, we observed damage in 68.6% of heads. The 95% confidence interval for this value is 50.7 to 83.2%. For sow heads that were shot in the behind the ear placement, we observed damage in 12.5% of those heads. The 95% confidence interval for this is 4.2 to 26.8% of heads. Here, the red indicates damage and the dotted pattern indicates no damage. If we move on to our boars, if we start with brain contact plane again, we'll see that for boars, the bolt was within the plane to have hit the brain, or the brain was in the plane of bolt travel for all heads across all three captive bolt placements, which is really good to see. If we move on to look at our brain damage results from boars, again, these are the heads that we visually saw damage to the brain in. Again, we don't have statistical comparisons between these, so it's just reporting what we observed. For these graphs, the red indicates heads that had damage, and the dotted pattern indicates heads that did not have damage. So for our boars that were shot in the frontal placement, we observed damage to 91.7% of those heads. The 95% confidence interval for this value is 61.5 to 99.8% of heads. For the boars that were shot in the temporal placement, we observed damage in 13.3% of those heads. The 95% confidence interval for this is 1.7 to 40.5% of heads. For boars that were shot in the behind the ear placement, we observed damage in 50% of the heads. The 95% confidence interval for these values is 23 to 77%. That concludes our results, and we'll now move on to our implications. So, with all of that considered, of the three captive bolt placements that were evaluated in this study, the frontal placement appears to be the most reliable at this time. The reliability of the frontal placement over the alternative temporal and behind the ear placements was indicated by the least tissue for the captive bolt to travel through, the greatest potential target area or greatest brain area, and a high prevalence of brain damage. Within the total tissue thickness, it's important to consider the amount of bone tissue or cranial thickness compared to the amount of soft tissue thickness. Bone fragment can actually be lodged from the captive bolt and act as a further projectile to cause more damage to the brain. Soft tissue cannot act as a further projectile and may actually slow down the bolt so that it has less velocity by the time it reaches the bone and or the brain. Future studies related to both the temporal and behind the ear alternative placements are warranted. Additionally, future studies related to the capacity of various captive bolt devices should be evaluated, specifically for diverse animal populations such as sows and boars weighing over 200 kilograms. It should be noted that some captive bolt devices may not have the capacity to consistently reach and cause damage to the brain depending on the bolt travel distance of the device. With that, I'd like to move on and discuss a few limitations of this study. First, we weren't able to obtain the target number of boar heads. Again, this was due to the plant not purchasing large enough boars to meet the size criteria for our study based on the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, we used refrigerated cadaver heads as a model for live animals. When we're using cadaver heads, we are not able to determine the efficacy of captive bolt placement because ultimately we're looking at a head that's already dead. However, by using these cadaver heads, we eliminate the potential for causing pain or suffering to animals in a captive bolt placement where we don't know what the outcome might be. In terms of using refrigerated heads, an adjustment factor is required based on some earlier work that we've done to obtain the unchilled soft tissue thickness from these chilled heads. Our earlier work indicates that an adjustment factor is not required to obtain the unchilled total tissue thickness or cranial thickness from these chilled heads. And lastly, only one type of captive bolt device was tested in this study, and there are multiple types, and different bolt length cartridge combinations yield different outcomes. With that, I'd like to conclude by saying that at this time, the frontal placement may present the least risk for the captive bolt euthanasia of swine that weigh 200 kilograms or more with the specific captive bolt device used in this study. If you have any questions, please reach out via email and I'd be happy to discuss anything further with you. I'd now like to acknowledge a few people. First, I'd like to acknowledge the collaborators and co-authors on this study, Casey Allen, Dr. Angela Basinger, Dr. Madonna Benjamin, Jen Berger, Dr. James Claus, Dr. Brian Greco, Emily Massey, Dr. Brett O'Brien, Dr. Alex Ramirez, Dr. Aaron Rendall, Dr. Archimedes Reyes, Dr. Pearl Zhitnitsky, and Dr. Kurt Vogel. I'd also like to thank the undergraduate research assistants in the Animal Welfare Lab at UW River Falls for their assistance with data collection. I'd also like to thank the commercial slaughter establishment that provided us with the cadaver heads for this study, as well as the commercial meat processing company that provided the bandsaw and blades for use in this project. Bunzl Processor Division and Jarvis Corporation provided studying equipment and technical support that was greatly appreciated. I'd lastly like to thank the National Pork Board for funding this work. And these are the references that have been cited throughout this presentation. And again, I'd like to encourage you, if you have any questions, to please reach out. Otherwise, thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation today.